Hi there, in this video we are comparing the Sigma 18-50 with the Tamron 17-70. Now these two lenses, they both have a lot of things in common, like they're both zoom lenses with a fixed 2.8 aperture, which is obviously great for us video shooters. But they're also incredibly different, which in my opinion makes it a bit easier to decide on which one of these two that you should get. Now, I won't spend too much time on specs in this video. I prefer to show you how these lenses perform and how they work in real life. So I'm just going to show you these specs here real quick and then we'll move on. Now, with that out of the way, I want to settle something that I see online whenever people are arguing over these two lenses. They have pretty strong supporters on both sides. The Tamron isn't big and heavy. The Sigma just happens to be incredibly small. Even compared to an APS-C Prime, the Sigma will still look tiny. Now, granted, the Sigma is lighter than the Tamron, but even combined, they're not as heavy as the Sigma 18-35 or even a full frame 24-70, and that's combined. Now, I'm not saying that size doesn't matter. There's definitely some pros and cons when it comes to size, and we'll talk more about that in a minute. Now, let's look at how these lenses perform. Sorry for taking so long. Now, if we look at the reach, the difference between these two on the wider end isn't that big if you're not using active stabilization on your camera. And the reason why I want to bring up active stabilization is because the Tamron lens have built-in optical stabilization, which lets you shoot at those 17 mils in most situations. With a Sigma, you may find yourself wanting to turn on active steady shot, which will have a crop on your image. 18 mil with regular IBIS turned on. Let's go into the menu and switch to active stabilization. Okay, this is active steady shot, so just to give us an idea of how much the camera is cropping in. This might not look super dramatic on a wider shot like this, but in some situations, if you're shooting indoors or where there's not a lot of room to move around, it could be a bit problematic if you want to shoot handheld and at the same time you need to fit something in frame. On the longer end, the Tamron obviously have a leg up on the Sigma with its 70 millimeters, while the Sigma obviously taps out at just 50 mil. Here we are at 50 mil on the Sigma 18-50 f2.8, and we're shooting 2.8 wide open in this video and in all these tests because, well, if you have a lens at 2.8, you probably want to shoot at f2.8 as much as possible, especially on an APS-C or Super 35 camera, where you won't be getting the same amount of subject separation if you stop down to like f4 or even lower. So here we are at f2.8. Both of these lenses show levels of distortion, which is usually the case with zoom lenses, where you get a barrel distortion out on the wider end, and as you zoom in, it typically changes or shifts to more of a pincushion distortion. Now, if you're shooting things like architecture, distortion is usually going to be pretty noticeable. You're going to get crooked lines, while out in the wild, it's usually less of a problem. Here we have the Sigma on the wider end, and I'm going to move to the edge of the frame where distortion might be a bit more visible, and let's see if we can notice any significant changes in the sharpness between the center and the edge of the frame while we're at it. 18-50, center, and let's move on over to this side. Do we see any major distortion here? And we are at 18 mil. Now let's moving back to the mark. Now, here we have the Tamron, same setup at 17 mil center frame, And I'm also going to move to the edge of the frame just like we did before to see if there's any major differences in sharpness and in distortion and all that. And I'm here at the center. I'm going to move to the corner of the frame to see how the corner sharpness and if there's any noticeable distortion when shooting a person like this instead of test charts and grids and all that kind of stuff. Which now, as we move into 50 and 70mm on these lenses to look for distortion, you can also check out the bokeh in the background. I find bokeh to be kind of a personal preference. Some people like smooth, creamy. Other people prefer a bit more interesting, a bit more busy bokeh. So I'm not gonna dive into that rabbit hole in this video, but there's gonna be plenty of examples in this video where you can compare the bokeh between these two lenses and see which one you prefer, if bokeh is a major factor for you. Obviously, when it comes to obliviating the background, like Christopher Frost would have said, the Tamron is gonna have a leg up on the Sigma with its 70mm. And overall, it looks like the Tamron also suffers just a tiny bit less from distortion. Now, in terms of sharpness, the Sigma seems to be a tiny bit softer on the wider end compared to the Tamron. If we zoom in, the Sigma seems to be a bit sharper in comparison, but then again, this Tamron at 70mm. If we zoom out to 50, the Tamron catches up with the Sigma in terms of sharpness, at least what I can see here on my monitor. In terms of autofocus performance, they both do pretty well. Right out of the box, the Sigma seems just a tiny bit smoother. The Tamron might do better with some small autofocus adjustments in camera, but I think they both perform pretty well in this test, so I wouldn't give a landslide victory to the Sigma just because it's a tiny bit smoother. I think some autofocus adjustments can bring up the Tamron to the same level of smoothness. Same thing when it comes to focus breathing. Both lenses performs well in terms of focus breathing, especially on the wider end. While we can see some shifts on the longer end on both of them, overall it's going to be hard to pick a clear winner here in my opinion if we stick to the same focal lengths. If we zoom in all the way on the Tamron, it's going to be a bit more noticeable, but still not that bad. One more thing I want to bring up when we talk about autofocus is the autofocus performance during a crash zoom. Both lenses seems to be dropping focus when you do a crash zoom. The Sigma recovers a bit faster and it's also less noticeable on the Sigma. If you slow down the zoom a bit, the Tamron will stay in focus. So if you're someone that's planning on doing tons of crash zooms, the Sigma will keep up a bit better, while on the Tamron you might have to slow down those crash zooms and maybe practice a bit and kind of find the limits of the autofocus when you're crash zooming on the Tamron. Overall, I don't do a ton of crash zooms. I don't think I've ever done a crash zoom, so for me it's not a deciding factor, but for you it might be, so that's why I'm bringing it up. Now, stabilization, when it comes to handheld footage, the Tamron takes the cake because of the optical image stabilization, or vibration compensation as Tamron calls it. But I know that some people have been complaining about the OIS on the Tamron, creating these weird jumps or jerks, and I came across these jerks or these jumps in some of the footage that I gathered for this test, especially if I were shooting on 50mm or 70mm, which is roughly 105mm full frame equivalent. But what I actually discovered after doing these tests was that I had messed up steady shot. I'd set it to manual and 35mm after shooting with some old prime lenses a while ago. So after I switched the settings on the steady shot to auto, when it uses the lens data to apply the correct amount of stabilization, I had to go out and grab some new test footage, and I just think it was night and day. I could get really nice looking smooth footage all the way up to 35mm. When I closed in on 50 and 70mm, the OIS felt just a tiny bit too sticky, but I didn't have any issues with those jumps or jerks, whatever you want to call them, on those focal lengths. If there were any jumps or jerks in the footage, they were now way less pronounced and more subtle. So if you have problems with those jumps in your stabilization on the Tamron, check your steady shot settings and make sure it's set to auto and not to manual. So the vibration compensation on the Tamron is, in my opinion, very, very useful for handheld footage. But if you're looking for super duper steady shots with any of these lenses, using a gimbal will obviously give you the best results. And I've already done a gimbal test with a Sigma where I kind of balanced the lens at around 35mm, which is roughly where the barrel is halfway extended. And that worked great on the tiny Weebill S with no need for any recalibrations when I zoomed in or zoomed out, which wasn't that surprising given the size and the overall weight of the tiny little Sigma. So then I did the exact same test with the Tamron. I extended the barrel to halfway out, which was, in my opinion, somewhere around 40mm. And same thing here, I was able to zoom in and zoom out without having to rebalancing the gimbal. That said, if you know you're only going to be shooting on the wider or the tighter end or somewhere in between, I'd still suggest that you balance your gimbal based on that focal length, just to save batteries on your gimbal so it don't die on you in the middle of a shoot or that kind of stuff. Now, let's talk about handling and ergonomics. First of all, none of these lenses have any buttons or any switches on the lens barrel, but when it comes to actual handling and ergonomics, I will have to give this one to the Tamron, as it's bigger and more comfortable to hold when you need a second point of contact for things like handheld footage. The size and the placement of the focus ring is also much better on the Tamron, so if you find yourself using manual focus for things like documentaries, run and gun and that sort of stuff, I would pick up the Tamron over the Sigma in a heartbeat, just because of the ergonomics. You can use manual focus on the Sigma, but it's not going to be as easy and as comfortable as putting focus on the Tamron. It's going to be way easier for you to work with, and especially if you're shooting long days where you're going to be pulling focus for a couple of hours manually on the lens itself. Another win for the Tamron would be that it's also fully weather sealed, which also kind of ties into that documentary run and gun type of shooting where you often end up shooting on various locations in all sorts of conditions. The Sigma has a mount gasket, but it's not fully weather sealed, so I'd be more careful with bringing out the Sigma into to rain or snow and that kind of stuff. But there's a lot of benefits that comes with a smaller Sigma. Not all shooters are looking for a grippable weather seal lens that they can pull manual focus on all day. If having a smaller but super versatile setup with great image quality is your goal and you're planning on using autofocus most of the time, then there's nothing out there, in my opinion, that can beat the Sigma in terms of size, price, and performance. The fact that it's also a bit cheaper than the Tamron also gives it a tiny bit of win in comparison, even if both of these lenses, in my opinion, are very affordable compared to the other options out there with similar specs. Same thing if you're looking for a gimbal lens, I would pick the Sigma over the Tamron any day of the week. So as far as picking one of these lenses, it's gonna come down to what type of shooter you are. If you're more of a run and gun type shooter where the lens stabilization, weather sealing and the manual focus is going to have a big impact on your workflow. And let's not forget that extra bit of reach for situations where you might not be able to get close enough to your subject. The Tamron would be the clear choice for all of you shooters out there. And on the other hand, if you're someone that makes travel videos, hiking videos, lifestyle videos, and you rely on autofocus for the most part. And I'm not saying that you can't use the Sigma for client work, and the opposite, it's a great lens for that. But if a compact size and low weight are important factors to you, then you would be much happier with the Sigma than the Tamron, because none of these lenses wins over the other on general performance, at least not by a landslide. One is going to be sharper on the wider end, one is going to be sharper on the tighter end, and so it goes and goes. Distortion more, less on the other one here and there. It all comes down to what you and this lens will be up to, and in what situations and environments you will find yourself in. That's basically the gist of this comparison. There's no clear winner. It all comes down to what you need this lens to be able to do. Okay. Okay, that's all I had for you today. Thank you so much for stopping by. I hope these samples and the information and everything made your decision making a bit easier. So don't forget to check the links down below, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.